Welcome back to Inside Politics. Our guest today is Dr. Thomas Schwartz, political science and history professor at Vanderbilt University. We're talking about the situation involving NATO, the United States, and Russia, and a possible invasion of Ukraine. Dr. Schwartz, the Russians are they miscalculating on part of this? I think they thought perhaps they detected a weakness in the U.S., perhaps they did weakness in this particular president. After all, the withdrawal of our troops from Afghanistan was somewhat of a disaster. At least it didn't look very good in terms of its optics. President Biden's job numbers approval numbers have been going down. You think Putin thought perhaps he could come up with something like this and get a fairly cheap victory in the U.S. and NATO would not necessarily push back?
Yes, I think that may be very well the case. The Afghanistan debacle was horrific, and I think it's larger international context. And I think the fact that it has had such a devastating impact on Biden's numbers, continuing with the other problems of a Western economy, inflation, other issues, Putin may have saw this as his opportunity. There is the argument, and I think it's got strong support for it, that Ukraine has been developing and connecting to the West so much more that if Putin doesn't act soon, he's not going to be able to accomplish his objective of weakening and destroying the Ukrainian state. So he may have felt that this is now or never type of action.
And there are other countries perhaps looking at what's going on over there. Let's take China. I think there's some people who believe Russia won't do this invasion, if they do it at all, until after the Olympics are over, and that'll be sometime this weekend, at the end of the weekend. Also, perhaps China is looking very carefully to see what happens, because based on what comes out there, they may decide whether to push forward on doing their own particular takeover or invasion of Taiwan.
That is possible, though I've been cautioned on that by another friend who mentioned the fact that China does not see Taiwan as similar to the Ukraine. Remember, Ukraine, for all of its having been part of the Soviet Union, has been an independent sovereign state recognized by all countries of the world for the last 30 years. Whereas Taiwan has not been recognized by any country. In fact, the United States has actually said we believe Taiwan to be part of China. We don't want a reunification effort to be done by force, but we have said that. So China may not want to see that similarity. On the other hand, Xi Jinping has given Putin support. So it's a very curious situation as to what China's read on this is, and whether it really wants to see the Russians go ahead with a forcible annexation of Ukraine.
What about North Korea? They've been shooting off intercontinental ballistic missiles over there again to test them. Are they looking perhaps to do something again to threaten South Korea in the wake of all these other things, if they perceive that they can gain something and the United States is weak?
I do think the North Koreans have decided, obviously, that they're going to want to restore their own role in that East Asian triangle. Their willingness to now launch missiles does seem to indicate that they see also an opportunity to flex muscles in this particular time period. There is this general sense in the world that the United States is in retreat. Obviously, there are attempts to counter that narrative, but that idea that the United States is pulling back, that it has so many domestic issues and problems, that it's so polarized that it cannot act in foreign policy, certainly out there, and it may very well be that North Korea believes that as much as Russia, China, and Iran do as well.
Several leaders of NATO countries, I'm thinking of France, perhaps some representatives from Germany as well, have gone over to Moscow and done some negotiating with Putin. Did Putin think he could perhaps divide and conquer? That he could find some weak spots in NATO that might perhaps give him a better deal in this? Has that happened so far? There hasn't been any overt signs of that.
Well, I think particularly, say, France, I think this was also a domestic political move. Elections are coming in France, and the French people certainly want to see their president playing a more dramatic role. But yes, of course, Putin's also wanting to see if the French and Germans might not have other interests from the Americans. The division or dividing NATO or destroying NATO has long been a Russian or Soviet objective. So I think getting Macron over, although Macron does not seem to have really provided any real opening to Putin.
President Biden continues to promise unprecedented and severe sanctions against Russia if there is some kind of invasion. What's he talking about, and what would be unprecedented about the things he might do?
I think the unprecedented thing would be to cut Russia off from the international financial networks, to really make it, to isolate it almost completely, the Russian economy. The other unprecedented nature may be to target Putin himself with sanctions, and to basically make him a pariah on a personal level, along with his closest associates. So I think at least that's the implication of some of these economic sanctions that he's talking about. And one imagines that they believe those to be the types of things that should be a deterrent to Putin to action.
Sanctions against Russia are not new, but they've not worked very well in the past, including those that were put on after Russia annexed the Crimea. So why will this be any different this time?
I doubt that it will. In effect, I think one of the more disturbing aspects of this may be that despite this very unified, strong statement by the Western powers, by the United States, if Putin acts anyway, that certainly shows that he has no real fears of the deterrent power of the Western countries. And in that sense, that would be a very, very disturbing development.
So this is something that could set in for a long time. You mentioned you thought that perhaps Putin had sort of a timeline he had to act before the window closes. What is that window and when will it close?
Well, that is the question. I think he thought Ukraine's continuing political and economic development was such that it was drawing closer to the West, and that by taking action now, he could upset that, prevent it. And it may well be that he is going to continue. It may well be if he takes action, this is decide to really ruin any prospect of an independent Ukraine state by seizing enough territory as to make that state and overturning its government in a way that would make it a failed state. So that may be his timeline. His timeline is to ultimately, he is 69 years old. He may recognize that he's not going to be around forever, and he wants to restore Russian power.
Dr. Thomas Schwartz, our guest on Inside Politics. He's a political science professor and history professor at Vanderbilt University. We're talking about the situation between Russia and the Ukraine, a possible invasion there. Has not happened as we're having this conversation, but it could be imminent at this point. Back to continue our conversation with Dr. Schwartz after you watch these messages.